Welcome to the Life with Impact podcast with me, Nadia Williford. And this is On the Ground with Nadia Owen. I am so privileged and honored to have a very special guest with me today. And she is from America, the United States. And she's got a story about living from trans to transformed. And that's the essence of this conversation. We are not here to discuss transgender ideology, but rather the amazing power of the gospel to renew, to reconcile, and to transform all people from all spheres of life. So, Laura, you are so welcome. Please introduce our listeners to who you are and sort of your background.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I'm so glad to be here. And I love what you said that this story is really not about transgenderism. It's really about what Jesus Christ has done. My husband and I run a ministry called Eden's Redemption. And we talk about how this world is broken because of sin, not because of God. God created a perfect paradise and an amazing creation when you look at like the beauty and the glory of creation. But people look at suffering and evil. But the Bible is what makes sense of all these questions. And so we talk a lot about that, but also how Jesus Christ redeems and how he restores, and the hope that one day all of this is going to be restored. There will be a new creation. So that's a big part of our ministry, and just seeing Jesus heal broken lives. I do a lot of speaking and teaching and a lot of traveling and just really spreading this message of the healing power of Jesus Christ. We use my testimony a lot, but also teach on subjects related to gender and sexuality from a biblical lens.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I first heard your story on, I think it was CBN, that recently published your just a short part of your testimony, sort of a
Yeah.
summary of your testimony. And I actually had a conversation, I think it was somewhere between the last 2 years. I had a conversation with a man, and he lived also like 20, 30 years as a woman. And he wrote a book, and he said the book's title was Not Man Enough to Be a Woman. And the reason he had that title is because when he told his dad, "Hey, I'm now a woman," his father told him, "You're not man enough to be a woman." And that struck a chord in his heart, And so at the end of the day, he titled that after his book, after he met Christ and came into salvation. And so it's such an honor to hear like the opposite spectrum of this conversation. So I've had a man who lived as a woman, but you are a woman who lived as a man for a very long time. So as we are looking into your story and a little bit of the background, let's get to the where it all started. Okay, the genesis of your journey. Um, in your testimony that I read, you mentioned that as a young lady, young girl, you sat with your words are bitterness, anger, and pain. But you didn't grow up very in a horrible, traumatized childhood sort of situation. So explain what you mean by bitterness, anger, and pain. If we're not thinking about trauma, what is that?
Yeah, well, I think, we're all created for the Garden of Eden. We are all created for a perfect paradise. And so when children are disappointed, when they're hurt, when they're neglected, whatever. I mean, those things are traumatizing in a sense. Even though I was not in some horrible kind of abuse, I was raised in a Christian home. Now that I'm older, I realize how good I had it and that I had a very loving home. And I don't blame my mom at all in any way, but I realize how the enemy really used the relationship with my mom to sow a lot of lies into my heart. And very early on, I became kind of bitter and angry at my mom because she was treating my brother a lot different. I felt neglected a lot, but I didn't realize what she was going through. Now that I'm older and I have a very different perspective, and I realized that my mom was raised in a very legalistic household, and she did not really understand the grace of God. She didn't really understand a relationship with God. She said she felt like she was on this performance treadmill for God, never being good enough, never doing enough. And so she was always like stressed out and burned out and just trying to do more and more. And she said several times she went to a pastor, or like twice, she went to two different pastors and like just cried and said, I'm trying so hard and I'm doing this and I'm doing this. And she couldn't fix the sinful things in her heart and just couldn't figure out like how to live this Christian life. And she was so overwhelmed. And she said, both of them basically said, Francine, you just need to try harder. And that's the only like advice she was given. Nobody told her about a relationship with Jesus, that he wants you to come and learn from him, that he is the one that will do the work in you. And so as a kid, several different things were going on. One, I'm hearing about the love of Jesus, but all I'm seeing at home is being stressed out and burned out and never being good enough. And just like, it was always kind of this, like, my mom was, I think, was under so much stress that it was like, go away, just like, get off of me, leave me alone, go to your room. And now that I'm older, I understand the pressure she was under. And I think she was just really, really overwhelmed with life. And I think a lot of us have been there. But a child doesn't understand. A child doesn't have that kind of responsibility. So I begin to interpret it as mom doesn't love me. And that wasn't true at all, but it's what I begin to believe. And so then once I had that filter on, it's like every interaction got put through that filter I already believed. And so anytime I was told I don't have time or whatever, it was like, see, she doesn't love you. That just wasn't true. But it's what I started to believe. But then because I didn't,
Before you
I,
move on, can I ask a question on that note?
sure.
Um, if you say your filter was mom doesn't love me, do you think there was anything she could have done that would have taken that lie away?
Yeah, and I think it also kids have different love languages. I don't know if you're
Sure.
familiar with that.
Hmm.
There was a book that was real popular, at least here in the States, years ago called The Five Love Languages, but kids receive love in different ways. And my love languages are quality time and physical touch. I wanted to be held and cuddled, and my mom was not a cuddly person at all. Now, my dad was. I have a rare father that was very, very affectionate, and he would just hold me and cuddle me. And my dad played games with me almost every night, which I did not realize as a child what a sacrifice that was. But my mom, I don't remember a single time she sat down and played with us. And so mom was very standoffish. Now that I'm older, I realize my mom was doing all the chores. She was doing all the cooking and the cleaning, and she didn't have time. But I just wish my mom had just taken time at times to really hold me. To that's just what I needed as a kid. That's how I received love, was to be held. I was very affectionate and just to spend time with me. But the only time my mom really spent time with me was helping me with spelling words and things like that. And so it was always kind of performance based, but that's what she grew up in. That's all she knew. So again, I don't blame her at all. I think that we all we all have brokenness, and we all carry that into our relationships. And people, we that's why we all need the healing of Jesus. And but God
Yeah.
used that. So even though my mom had these like broken things, and I can point to, okay, that's where I started to be angry at my mom, and I began to be full of bitterness and all this as a young child. But years later, that's what God was going to use to show me his transforming power. So if you're a parent that has made mistakes and maybe you're thinking, I've not shown my kid the love they need or whatever, all of us have made mistakes. All of us have fallen short. And every parent out there has made mistakes. But one thing, and we have a podcast as well called Redeeming Parents. And so we've made a podcast helping parents navigate this journey. And one of the most um, the I'll say on an upcoming episode that I'm working on right now, we talk a lot about how we've all fallen short and that no parent could be everything their child needs them to be, because ultimately we are supposed to point them to God. We're not omnipresent, we're not omniscient. We can't be everywhere our child needs us to be. We can't do everything they need us to do. We can't fulfill and satisfy their every need and desire, because only God can. And so that's, I think, as so a couple of things. I wish my mom had spent more time with me, been more affectionate, but ultimately, I really wish that my mom had just pointed me to the Lord instead of trying to satisfy my needs and desires, to teach me that she couldn't, but that God could. And that's what I really
Oh,
needed.
that's so powerful. Wow. Yeah. I needed to hear that today. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think every parent forgets that they are not their child's God. I mean, not that we think consciously that way, but we
Mhm.
try to be. We try to fulfill their every need and desire. We try to be their entire world. We try to meet all their needs. I mean, think about how most of their life, when they need something, we just go out and buy it. Rather than saying, let's pray and let's ask God. Now, I'm not saying for every little thing, but, teach them that God is their provider. When we're trying to
Yeah.
make some kind of decision, let's pray about it as a family. What does God want us to do? Instead, when I was little, we would think about what was logical or what we wanted or what, whatever. And then we would pray and ask that God would do that rather than going to the Lord and saying, God, what do you want? Because then you can see God's plan unfolding. You can see his power. You can see his guidance and direction.
Yeah, that's so good. Okay, so you went from bitterness, anger, pain, feeling actually a bit of rejection, I suppose, feeling not good
Yeah.
enough and all that. So that's the root of that. And then at what point did that turn into I am not a girl?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I started going to school. I didn't trust girls, and I did not have a good relationship with my sister either. And again, not her fault either. My sister was very, very dedicated to music. She played the French horn, and of course she says it's the horn. It's not the French horn, but that's what I called it all my life. But she was one of the most dedicated I've ever known. She practiced hours and hours and hours a day, and she became one of the best in the world. At one point, she was the principal horn of the Sydney Opera. And so, but I have no memories of my sister growing up and just always felt like she didn't have time for me, didn't want to be around me. And I was also, so I have to say too, sometimes I talk about things that were done to me that weren't right, but I was hyper, I was annoying, I was constantly demanding attention. And so people always say, well, kids don't know any better. But I remember as a little child giving my family the silent treatment if they weren't treating me right, or, trying to just be louder or be more annoying to get the attention or whatever, and holding bitterness in my heart, refusing to forgive. And I remember like sometimes just trying to like get as angry as possible, think about everything that ever done to me so I could get really angry. And then to get like, if I can give a strong enough reaction, then they'll see that I'm needing attention. I remember those things as a little child. So there's a two-sided coin of we have been greatly sinned against in this life, but we've all responded in sin. And so sometimes we need to take responsibility for our own actions because all of us are going to be failed in this life. All of us fall short for other people. All of us fail in our relationships. And yet we do a lot of things right, but ultimately all of us are going to make mistakes and we have a choice in how we respond. So again, not my sister's fault either, but I identified so much more with my dad and my brother. I spent all my time with them. And so then when I went to school, I just was uncomfortable around girls. I didn't know how to relate to the girls. And so it started this belief in my head that I should have been a boy. And the more that I thought that I would go play with the boys and I was uncomfortable around the girls. So I would just go play sports with the boys instead. But over the years that became more and more comfortable. But I
Hmm.
was also at 8 years old, I was sexually abused by another boy. And that brought a lot of shame into my life and a lot of guilt. But it also, I think one of the most impactful thing, and I couldn't share this for many, many years. This was incredibly painful for me. I didn't tell anybody till I was in my 30s. But the thing that really, really changed me, it, as much as I was ashamed and I knew it was wrong, it also opened up this door of curiosity. And so, and it opened up a sexual desire that should have never been there at that age. But that's just the reality of what happens. And so I went back to him later, and because this wasn't some big older scary man and this really traumatic thing. I mean, it's traumatic, but it wasn't like something I was afraid of. This was my friend's brother. And so I went back later and wanted to do things again, and he totally rejected me, wanted nothing to do with me, and was saying, like, we can't ever do that again. And he said that's how girls get pregnant. And I was so afraid. I knew nothing about puberty or gestation or anything like that. And so I was so terrified that I was pregnant. And I had I think the really traumatic thing for me in that was even as an 8-year-old girl, I felt used and thrown away like trash. And I remember this lie coming into my heart that men had all the power in relationships and I was just kind of at their mercy and just there to be used as long as they would want me. And I became very sexualized and started doing sexual things with other kids. And by the time that I was a teenager, I was desperate for sexual attention. And I think I was always I didn't realize it consciously, but I think I was always trying to solve that in a way, because I didn't ever want to feel that again. But yeah, so I think that's where that path
Well,
kind of started.
if I can say something about that, I think an often a misunderstanding that takes place is that people assume that when children are abused, that it's always a case of the child not wanting it. But that's not true. And
Right.
this is the horror of abuse. The horror of abuse, apart from it being violent and that, that's one thing. But the psychological harm of a little girl, let's say, for example, being used in a certain way by a person, and she feels at one point her body will start enjoying it because we are
Right.
sexual beings, and in another way she'll in those moments feel very special because she's receiving attention, and so the psychological stronghold that's formed in that child is so destructive. And that
Yeah.
is the monster that no one talks about. Everyone, when we think about child sexual exploitation or abuse, we often picture like a child saying, no, and then they're abused. But it's so much worse than that psychological effect. And that's what you are explaining, what happened to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, it was extremely traumatic, even though it doesn't sound like it to an outsider. And especially if you compare it with some of these horror stories you hear of sex trafficking and things like that. But to my little heart, I, I was extremely traumatized by this because I felt so used and I felt thrown away like trash. And I just felt like I had no worth or value. And so I just spent most of my childhood and young teen years trying to get sexual attention, both from boys and girls, and just trying to fulfill that desire. And there were times that I would even feel I think that's where some of the gender confusion started. I already had gender confusion anyway because I was jealous of boys. I wanted to be a boy. I felt like my mom loved my brother more. I mean, there were various reasons, but I think this is where it really turned into something more intense, where I felt like men had the power in the relationship. And so I liked the feeling if I was with a girl, I liked pretending like I was the boy in the relationship. And but by the time I had a lot of health problems throughout the years, I've always had a lot of health problems ever since I was a little bitty child. And so by the time I started puberty, I was always having a lot of weight problems and just so here's this girl that wanted so much sexual attention, but then I was always struggling with my weight, even as a 10 or 11-year-old child. And so I faced a lot of rejection because of it. And
Hmm.
that was devastating to this girl who is already feeling rejected. And then I was rejected over and over and over and over again. And so by the time I was in high school, I was really angry at God for making me the way that he did. I'd been diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome, among other autoimmune diseases that I've had, but they told me that I would likely never get pregnant. And so I was like, if God did this on purpose, if God created me and God doesn't make mistakes, and yet I have a body that I don't want in the first place, and I'm this girl that is just used and thrown away like trash and rejected, and then I'm having all these weight problems and and then on top of that, my female system's not even working right. Like if God made me this way, then God is a jerk and I don't want anything to do with God. And so that's when I really started to turn away from God. I was so angry that God made me a girl that always had these weight problems, and it just felt so unfair. So I told God that I would never serve him again. I wanted nothing to do with God. And I really became very anti-Christian. I wanted nothing to do with the church, with Christians. And for years, I blamed Christians and I would say, those hateful Christians down at that church, they were so blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I look back, I don't think anybody did anything to me. It was my own anger at God. And I told God I would never serve him again. And I became extremely sexualized. And I started pursuing sexual relationships any way that I could, both men and women, mostly with men, but I really didn't care. It was more about feeling wanted, feeling like somebody wanted me and would not leave me.
I
And
think
so I,
would it be a fair assessment to say that you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it seems to me like what you wanted was control because it appears like there were so many things out of your control, and it goes back to that first boy. He was in control at that moment, and it's every boy that rejected you. It seemed like they had the upper hand, and suddenly you were like, okay, so I want that upper hand. I want that control. So I need to be a boy. Would that be
yeah,
a fair assessment?
yeah, I think it was. And I was always trying to, and I don't know that I consciously thought of it as control. I think it was in a way. I didn't want to be left. I had felt so much rejection in my life and I didn't want to be left anymore. I wanted somebody to want me. And that's really at its deepest desire. And so what happened though, I thought if I gave myself away sexually, that I could find love and happiness that I was wanting. Instead, I was used and abused and dumped and rejected over and over and over and over again until I felt like absolute trash. I felt way worse than I had before. And by the time I got into college, I was deep into a pornography addiction and I was still struggling a lot with my weight. And it had been up and down throughout my life. So there were times that I would finally work really hard. I would lose some weight and then, but because of other health problems, it would burn out my adrenals and I'd have thyroid problems. And so it was so hard on my body to do all that. Then my health would crash again. I'd gain weight again. And so it was this roller coaster, but every time that I would get thin and I would look pretty, and then I would have all this attention, and then once I would gain weight again, it was like everybody would just scatter. And so I began to believe that the only worth or value I had was in my body and what I looked like. And so I remember thinking, if I was the man in this relationship, I know how I would treat a woman. And I began to, instead of me having to depend on somebody else wanting me, I can be the one who pursues. And I had just noticed that, guys that were overweight, it seemed to have an easier time having a girlfriend as opposed to an overweight girl having a boyfriend. So I remember just fantasizing about that, being jealous of men because they had that control. Not that I wanted to control a woman like to, put her under my thumb. Not that kind of control, but just to love a woman and so that I wouldn't be dumped again. And that sounds horrible, but I think that's just the reality of this. When a child is wounded like that, and sometimes we have these deep wounds that we're always trying to fix rather than bringing them to the Lord to fix, and we end up just hurting other people.
Yeah, definitely. Doesn't it's not it sound strange at all to me. It makes perfect sense so far. Yeah. So how old were you at this point?
I was 25 and I had spent the last several years up to that point. I had joined an adult hookup site and I was having like random one night stands all over the state. I was trying so hard to feel loved and accepted. And so this was getting to a really desperate point. And that's when I started fantasizing, but I had never heard the word transgender. That's what a lot of people forget, how much our society has changed. This was 2007. But I started looking up on the internet. I remember just looking up girl becoming a boy. Just like I was just wondering, has anybody ever thought this? And I was stunned when I saw like thousands of results come up. And I was like, whoa, there's other people that have thought this. Like I'm not crazy. And so I found a support group where I was living in Oklahoma at the time and went and showed up for the first meeting. And within 5 minutes, they were like, "Oh, you are definitely transgender." It's like I knew it. I knew this was me. Like I belong. And it's like all of this makes sense. And I could kind of dismiss all of the rejection. And it's like the reason I was rejected is because I was supposed to be a man. That's why I was never wanted as a woman. And so
And
that's
I want
where
to, yeah, sorry, but I want to stop right there and say, if you want to hear the rest of the story, you'll have to wait for part 2. So be sure to listen to this one and then be sure to listen to part 2.